What would you do if you were the one nurse brave enough to take a job caring for a man who had not let another human being touch him in 11 years, walked into his house knowing that everyone before you had been dismissed for the crime of reaching too close, and on the third day did the one thing that was strictly forbidden, laid your hand over his, and watched the most dangerous man on the coast go, utterly dangerously still? 11 years? For 11 years, no one had touched Dorian Kovac. Not a doctor, not a barber, not a single member of the staff who dressed his wounds through gloves and flinched from his shadow, because everyone knew the rule that was never written down and never needed to be, that the man who ruled the coast could not bear the hand of another person on his skin. And then a soft, quiet, generously built nurse, who had not been told the rule or had been told and decided it was nonsense, reached out on the third day and simply held on, and in that instant, something 11 years in the making began at last. This is a story of hidden worth, of a man armored in isolation, and of the woman whose steady, fearless hands undid a solitude no one else had dared to touch. Cleo Bright had spent her whole life being the person who stayed when everyone else stepped back. She was 31, soft and generously curved, with a calm, warm face and steady hands, and a way of moving through a frightened room that made the fear go quiet. And she was a private duty nurse, one of the finest on the coast, though few of the wealthy families who hired her. She had learned early the arithmetic of a woman built like her, which was that the world took one look and decided, before she had said a word, that she was soft in every way that mattered, unremarkable, easy to overlook. She had absorbed that judgment the way she absorbed everything, without letting it move her. Because Cleo Bright had one quality that a lifetime of being underestimated had only sharpened, which was that she did not spook. She had held the hands of the dying and the violent and the terrified, and she had learned to be the one steady thing in a collapsing room, the calm at the center that did not flinch and did not flee. What none of the families who dismissed her ever discovered was what Cleo actually was underneath the softness they mistook for weakness. Because Cleo Bright read bodies the way other people read words. It was more than training, though she had that in abundance. It was an instinct so fine it unnerved the doctors she worked with, an ability to look at a person and know, from 100 small signs no one else registered, what was wrong beneath the surface, the injury behind the flinch, the pain behind the stillness, the wound behind the armor. She had a memory that held every symptom she had ever seen, and an eye that missed nothing. And she had spent a career being the nurse who caught the thing the specialists had walked past, and never once being credited for it, because the world did not expect brilliance from a soft, quiet, heavy woman with gentle hands. And on the day everything changed, she took the job that a dozen nurses before her had been dismissed from, walked into the fortress of a man no one had touched in 11 years, and did not know, or did not care, that she had been hired to keep her distance. The man was Dorian Kovac, and he was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad and dressed in a charcoal suit cut with lethal precision, the head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the freight lines and the fear of every powerful family for 100 miles. He rarely raised his voice. He never needed to. And 11 years ago, something had happened to him, a betrayal so intimate and so total that it had closed him like a fist, because the last person he had trusted enough to let close had used that closeness to put a blade in him, that he would never again let another human being's hand rest on his skin. It was not vanity, And it was not madness. It was the logic of a man who had learned that touch was the thing that killed you. He had a recent injury that needed daily care, and he had gone through 11 nurses in a season, each of them dismissed the moment they reached too close, each of them warned and still unable to hide the fear because a frightened person's hands shake, and a shaking hand on Dorian Kovac was a thing that ended employment or worse. And then the 12th arrived, and she was not warned or did not heed it, and she did the work with steady, unhurried hands, and a calm that did not once falter. And on the third day, when he tensed against the pain of a dressing change, and his knuckles went white on the arm of the chair, she laid her hand over his. Not a nurse's touch, not clinical, just a hand, warm and steady, resting over his white-knuckled fist, and she said in a low, unbothered voice, "Breathe, it is nearly done. I have got you." The room went utterly silent. Dorian Kovac, who had not felt the deliberate touch of another human being in 11 years, went so still that Cleo felt it, and looked up and saw the most dangerous man on the coast staring at her hand on his as though it were a live thing or a miracle or a threat he did not know how to name. Every guard in that house would have told her to run. She did not run. She did not snatch her hand back and stammer an apology. She simply held on, steady and unafraid, and let him feel that a human hand could rest on him and mean nothing but comfort. And Dorian Kovac, armored in 11 years of solitude, felt something crack that he had believed sealed forever. He did not fire her, though the whole house braced for it. He tried, once, the next morning, out of pure reflex, the way a wounded animal snaps at the thing that got too close. And Cleo had looked at him steadily and said, "You can dismiss me for touching you, or you can let me do my job properly, which requires that I touch you, and I promise you that in 11 years of frightened people, I am the first who is not afraid, and that is worth more to you than distance." And Dorian Kovac, to the astonishment of everyone, had let her stay. Because the thing about a man who has armored himself in untouchability is that he has also condemned himself to a life without a single gentle hand. And he had forgotten, until a soft-spoken nurse laid her palm over his fist, how much a person could starve for something so simple. Cleo treated him exactly as she treated anyone, with total competence and complete calm, and a steadiness that did not once waver. And she touched him when the work required it, matter-of-factly, without fear, and slowly, day by day, the man who had not been touched in 11 years began to unclench. He began to look for her in the house. He began, without quite admitting it, to time his pain to her arrival. And Cleo, who had spent her whole life being overlooked, found herself in the strange position of being the one person in the world a lethal man had begun to trust. And something in her unfolded too, because he did the thing no one had done. He asked her what she saw, and she told him, and time after time she was right about things his own doctors had missed. Every evening they sat over a decanter of amber whiskey. He poured for himself, and a cup of tea he poured for her, and he told her about the betrayal that had closed him. The intimate blade, things he had said to no one, and she listened without flinching. The way she did everything. He learned she softened at kindness, and had been taught to expect none. And it made him want to burn down every person who had ever overlooked her. And one night, his hand, the hand no one had been allowed to touch, rose of its own accord to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and Cleo, who read every reluctance in a body, saw what it cost him to reach out, and did not move, and let him, and it undid them both. But Cleo, being Cleo, had begun to notice something about that recent injury that would not let her rest, a wrongness in how it had happened, and it pulled at her. The cruelty came at a formal gathering, and it arrived wearing the confidence of a woman who had never once been made to feel small. Dorian had brought Cleo in a gown of deep garnet that celebrated every curve she had spent her whole life apologizing for, and midway through the evening, a sleek, beautiful woman named Vittoria, who had spent 2 years positioning herself to be the next Signora Kovac, cornered her by the tall windows with an audience in tow. "Oh, the nurse!" Vittoria said brightly, loud enough for the room, letting her eyes travel over Cleo's body with theatrical sympathy. "How novel! He let you touch him, they say. Do not let it turn your head, sweetheart. A man who has been alone that long will imprint on whatever warm thing gets close. It is not love. It is starvation. When he remembers himself, he will want a woman who belongs in his world, and nobody, and I do mean nobody, looks at a soft little nurse your size and sees a queen. Enjoy the attention while it lasts." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and the old Cleo would have absorbed it, kept her face calm, stepped quietly away. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not lower her eyes. "You are right that he let me close," Cleo said, her voice quiet and perfectly level. "Which means I have spent weeks with my hands on the one man in this city no one else is allowed to touch, close enough to see things no one else sees." She tilted her head. "And I have seen, Vittoria, that the injury everyone believes was an accident was nothing of the kind, and that a person who wanted it to look like an accident was standing very close to him when it happened. So do be careful whose starvation you mock. She might be the only person alive who has been near enough to see how he was really hurt." The silence had teeth. Vittoria did not understand it. But a man standing just past her shoulder went the color of ash. And Dorian, who had crossed the floor in silence, took Cleo's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of the entire gathering, letting the whole room see him choose to be touched. "You never make yourself small in this house again, Kedvezem," he murmured, using the endearment for the first time. "Not in my world. And never in front of me." But the man who had gone pale understood exactly what the nurse had just said. Because he had been the one standing close, and he had assumed, as everyone always assumed, that the soft woman-changing dressings was too far beneath notice to read the truth in a wound. The man was Tibor, Dorian Kovac's concierge, and he had made one intimate, unforgivable mistake. The injury that had brought Cleo into the house had not been an accident at all. It had been Tibor's first attempt, a careful, deniable thing, the opening move of a 2-year plan to hand the family to a rival, designed to look like misfortune and to weaken Dorian slowly while a larger strike was prepared. And it had nearly worked, because the one defense Dorian had built his whole life around, never letting anyone close enough to hurt him, had a fatal flaw, which was that it also kept away anyone close enough to see the truth. No one touched Dorian Kovac, so no one could read his body, so no one could tell that his injury bore the small wrong signs of a thing done on purpose. No one, that is, until a nurse with unfoolable hands and no fear laid her palm on him and felt through her fingertips the story the wound was actually telling. Tibor smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Cleo brought it to Dorian that night, and she brought it the way she brought everything, completely, and with the certainty of a woman who did not guess about injuries but read them. She had gone back over the wound with the eye that missed nothing, and her hands did not lie. The injury had not happened the way it had been reported. The angle was wrong for an accident and exactly right for a deliberate act by someone standing close and trusted. The healing told a story of something that had been meant to weaken rather than kill outright, a slow bleed of a man's strength, which was not how accidents behaved, but was precisely how a patient saboteur worked. And when she thought about who had been close enough, who had been trusted enough to stand at Dorian's side in an unguarded moment, who had reported the accident and arranged the care and selected, she realized each of the 11 frightened nurses who could never get close enough to see. The one man who had understood that Dorian's untouchability was not a weakness to be overcome, but a shield to be exploited. She laid it out on the table without drama, in order, and Dorian Kovac went very still, and then he did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask her twice. He did not demand. He looked at a case built from the angle of a wound and the pattern of its healing, assembled by a woman the world had dismissed as a soft pair of hands, and said quietly, "Tibor." "Yes," said Cleo. Then he took her face in his hands, the touch still new enough to move them both, and said, "If I move on him, and he sees it coming, he will not come at me. He will come at you because you are the only person alive who has been close enough to read what he did." And neither of them knew that Tibor had already made that decision. The fortress went dark at 2:30. Cleo woke to a silence so complete it pressed against her skin, and every instinct a lifetime of reading the truth in bodies had honed screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. The power was out. The generators stayed dead. Dorian had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication. And Cleo, sitting up in the dark, knew with terrible certainty that they had come while he was away, and that they had come for her, because she was the one who had been close enough to see. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not run blindly. She thought, cold and clear, the way she always had at the bedside when a body was failing, and panic would have killed it. 2 floors below, a silenced weapon coughed, and a body met the marble. And Cleo Bright did the thing that no one in that house, friend or enemy, had ever thought to account for, because the one place in that fortress she knew better than any guard was the medical wing she had lived in for weeks, and a sick room to a nurse who does not panic is not a place of helplessness. It is a room full of tools. She moved through the dark by memory to the medical suite, where a hardwired line to the private physician service ran on its own circuit and got one message out. Then she did the thing the men in the dark could never have predicted, because a woman who understands medicine understands exactly what everything in that room can do. She rigged the heavy oxygen cylinder against the door so it would fall across the entry. She slicked the tile inside the doorway with the spilled contents of a supply cart. And she took from the crash supplies the one thing a nurse understands better than any soldier, a sedative and a soaked cloth, and she waited in the dark with the calm of a woman who had held steady. The first man through the door went down on the slick and cracked against the fallen cylinder. The second came in fast behind him, and Cleo, who did not panic, stepped out of the dark and pressed the soaked cloth over his face with the unhurried competence of someone who had sedated combative patients for a living, and he folded to the floor. She did not scream, or gloat, or run. She stepped over them and moved deeper into the wing she owned, toward the safe room she had noted on her first day. Because a good nurse always knows where the exits are. And she heard behind her the unhurried footsteps of Tibor, who had not rushed in with his men, who understood exactly what she had just done. "Cleo," he said pleasantly into the dark. "Remarkable? 11 nurses could not get near him, and the one who could turns out to be the most dangerous thing in this house." He was moving carefully now. "Do you know, I built my entire plan on the one certainty that never failed me, that no one would ever get close enough to Dorian Kovac to read what I had done. His untouchability was my perfect shield." He paused. "And then you laid your hand on him and ruined 11 years of the best defense I ever had. But you have made one mistake tonight. You are alone, and I am not. And I have spent a career learning where frightened things hide." And Cleo Bright, standing in the dark with her heart steady and her hands steadier, did the one thing he never expected, because she was not, and had never once been, the frightened thing he imagined. "You have made the mistake, Tibor," she said. "Silence. You think you are hunting something afraid," she said. "But I have spent my whole life being underestimated by people exactly like you. And here is what that builds. In the end, a woman who does not panic, and who read the truth in a wound you were sure no one would ever be allowed to touch. I sedated one of your men and put the other down on his own boots. And everything I found, the angle of the injury, the pattern of the healing, the truth that you hurt him and called it an accident, is already gone, written out, dated, sitting with 3 people who will hand it to Dorian and the whole commission the moment I stop confirming I am alive." She let it settle in the dark. "You built your whole betrayal on the certainty that no one could get close to him. You never once considered that the woman close enough to heal him would be close enough to convict you." Tibor said nothing, which was the closest thing to a concession she would ever get. And in that silence, the front gates below exploded inward, with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Dorian had come home. Time seemed to fracture. Gunfire erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute. Tibor turned toward the sound, and in the dark of a wing he did not know as well as he believed. He misjudged his step, and Cleo, who had walked those rooms in the dark 100 times, moved past him to the exact place she knew. A heavy equipment stand stood and put it between them, and was through the safe room door and turning the bolt before he understood she had moved. And then the corridor beyond, flooded with light, and Dorian filled it, soaked in rain, his eyes wild and searching. Bence, his loyal lieutenant, poured in behind him with 4 armed men, and the trap Tibor had spent 2 years building snapped shut around him instead. Dorian had him by the throat against the wall before he could speak. "2 years," he said. "You put a blade in me and called it an accident, and used my own solitude as the cover for it. And when a woman finally touched me and saw the truth, you came into my house for her." Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear, and he released Tibor to Bence's men and crossed to Cleo in 2 strides. His hands moved frantically over her arms, her face, her shoulders. The man who could not be touched now, desperate to touch, checking for any harm to what was his. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I'm all right," Cleo said, steady even now, though her fingers curled into his soaked coat. I sedated one and let the other trip over an oxygen tank. I did tell you, my patients do as they are told. And Dorian Kovac let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her hair, and then he framed her face in his trembling hands, the touch no longer strange, and looked at her the way no one in her whole, overlooked life had ever looked at her. You are magnificent, he breathed. For 11 years I made my untouchability a fortress, and it became the very thing that let him hurt me in the dark. And you undid it in 3 days and read the truth off my own skin. And then his voice cracked open entirely. Do you know what I understood? The day you laid your hand on mine, he said hoarsely. That I had spent 11 years believing that to be touched was to be killed, and that the woman who finally reached me was not a danger at all, but the first safe hand I had felt since the night I closed myself off. He pressed his forehead to hers. I let no one near me for 11 years, Kedvesim, and you walked in and held on, and it saved my life twice. Tibor, the man who had smiled at Dorian Kovac for years, while turning his own solitude into a weapon, learned the price of underestimating her before the week was out. Dorian did not act in blind rage. He let Cleo lay the whole of it before the commission. The deliberate injury, the false accident, the 2-year plan that had used his untouchability as its cover, all of it read from the angle of a wound and the pattern of its healing, by a woman that world had dismissed as a soft pair of hands. And when the 5 families had seen the evidence, and the rival house that had backed Tibor's slow betrayal was exposed along with him, Cleo did not counsel death. You do not need to make him a martyr, she said quietly. You need to make him nothing. So they did it her way. They stripped Tibor of every asset and exposed 2 years of treason to the very families he had schemed to serve, and cast him out, alive, bankrupt, disgraced, a man whose name became a warning whispered on every dock, a fate the old men agreed was far crueler than any quick and merciful bullet. And Vittoria, who had said that nobody looks at a soft little nurse and sees a queen, discovered that the man she had arrived with was tangled in the very plot Cleo's evidence had exposed, and spent a long and humiliating season answering questions she could not answer well. Months later, on a bright morning, washed gold with new sun, Cleo Bright stood on the terrace of the fortress she now moved through, as though she had never once been overlooked, her hand resting easily in the hand of a man no one else on earth was allowed to touch, and she did not make herself small for anyone anymore. She wore rich colors tailored to celebrate every curve she had spent her whole life apologizing for. She took up exactly as much room as she pleased. Dorian came out and stopped, simply to watch her, and then crossed to her and took her hand, without a flicker of the old hesitation, the way a man does a thing he has decided is his to do forever. You're staring, mister. Kovac, she said, a smile in her voice. I will never stop, he said. Do you know what I understood the 3rd day when you laid your hand over mine, he said quietly. That I had built a fortress out of never being touched and called it strength, and that it had very nearly killed me, because a man no one can reach is a man no one can save. He lifted her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, over the heart no one had been allowed near in 11 years. They taught you that a woman like you was soft, Kedvesem, as though soft were the opposite of strong. And you turned out to be the only hands on earth, steady enough to reach a man who had made himself impossible to reach, and to read, in a single wound, the betrayal that would have ended me. You were never just a soft pair of hands. You were the only ones I ever needed. She looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one, and yet bowed entirely to her. And for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent her whole life being told she was soft and unremarkable and easy to overlook, dismissed on sight for the gentleness that was in fact her greatest strength, and she had proven every last one of them wrong. Because the steady, fearless hands the world had underestimated, the instinct that read the truth in a body no one else could touch, had saved an empire and a life. A man had gone 11 years without a single human touch. And a curvy nurse walked in, laid her hand over his, and by the time his enemy understood what she was, she had cracked open a fortress no one else had dared approach and read, off his own skin, the betrayal that would have buried him. If Cleo and Dorian's story of hidden worth, patient tenderness, and hard-won trust moved you, if your heart caught when the nurse laid her hand over the hand no one had been allowed to touch, smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the gentleness the world calls weakness is so often the very strength that saves. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Cleo and Dorian's story?